The years after Alone in the Dark: The New Nightmare were somewhat tumultuous for Infogrames, as the company took part in classic corporate shenanigans, which also spelled the demise of the intended trilogy, which The New Nightmare was the first part of. 7 years after The New Nightmare, Infogrames released a new Alone in the Dark under their Atari label, this time just called Alone in the Dark, marking the second time a game would carry that name, but not the last. As usual, I'll be playing the PC version of the game as unaltered as possible. The menu has once more received a facelift, and a repeating video of scenery from the game plays in the background. While many aspects of the main menu reveal that the game was primarily a console release, such as with the button prompts using clearly Xbox-style icons, interacting with the menu works quite well with a mouse. The audio options are unfortunately limited, and while you can turn off the music, you can only adjust the master volume. This is especially a problem, since, as tends to be the case with games from this decade, there are no subtitles available, something which is always a massive negative for me. The visual options are somewhat basic, but still enough to allow for performance customization. The most comprehensive portion of the options menu is the control configuration segment, where you can rebind practically everything and customize sensitivity settings in different scenarios, and most importantly, choose whether Y-axis controls can be inverted. Starting the game, you're immediately thrust into a POV view or the blurry view of someone lying on a bed, as a tutorial pop-up instructs you on how to control the camera. By looking around, you can see two people talking about something involving a plan which has apparently gone wrong, while one of the characters is almost panicking, and the other is clearly more calm and composed. They mention something called the Path of Light and fissures coming out of a man. Then they turn their attention to you, as the more calm man sits you up and examines you, which introduces yet another mechanic. Your vision becomes clear and begins to blur once more, as another tutorial pop-up appears explaining how to blink manually, which is used to temporarily clear your vision. There is an older man on the bed across from you, and he calls you Edward before being quite forcefully told to be quiet, effectively showing that you two are in somewhat of a difficult situation. Another man appears and calls this old man Paddington and explains the three men still need him, as he is the only one who can control some stone. But you're not so fortunate, and one of the men is instructed to take you to the roof to be disposed of. At this point, you technically gain more control and can move around, which in this first-person view functions in a way you'd expect. The movement controls move you in different directions, while the mouse is used to look and turn around. In practice, though, your captor is guiding your path, and you're basically forced to just walk forwards while occasionally blinking to see what's going on around you. Soon enough, things go awry and a strange fissure moves across the wall, something which your captor seems to blame you for, as he pushes you against a pipe. Interestingly, if you close your eyes, the fissure is still visible, albeit as a beam of light. The fissure then returns and seems to somehow attack your captor, who disappears in a puff of blood as you fall to a lower level. Now you're free to move on your own, even if you only have one path forwards. This corridor, in a sense, is a way for the player to experiment a little with the basic controls, while admiring the really nice dynamic lighting system of the engine. Eventually, you reach a room at the end of the path, where control is taken from you as you move into cutscene mode and finally see yourself, in a moment which is really relatable to me as a 40-year-old man, realizing how obsessed I still am with video games.
My God. Who the hell am I?
After the horrible realization that you're a middle-aged man, you get to experiment more with how the basic controls of the game work, as you find yourself in third-person mode. With the keyboard and mouse settings, while in the third-person mode you move Edward in somewhat standard tank controls, which might feel a bit strange. This is because turning doesn't actually happen while you stand in place, but instead Edward does a bit of a curve as he turns while moving. If you move into the corridor, the camera moves into a position behind the character, and in this mode the controls feel slightly less strange, and it seems like turning is closer to more traditional tank controls. There is somewhat of an explanation for this, even though I don't really understand the reasoning. If playing on a controller, the fixed camera controls work differently, as instead of tank controls you merely push the analog stick in the direction you wish to go on the screen, and Edward then automatically turns to face that direction. I'm not sure why the controller and keyboard versions of the controls function differently, but because they do, it's good to know the difference when deciding what control scheme to use. This leads to another interesting design choice. Alone in the Dark supports X-input controls natively, but it might not seem so initially, as when you launch the game it doesn't seem to react to controller inputs. To actually get the game to recognize the inputs, you need to first go into the key bindings menu and choose to rebind a key. If at this point you press a button on the controller, the game asks whether you would like to change the controller inputs instead. It is a very curious choice to have hidden controller support in this way, but at least the option actually exists and is functional. After getting somewhat accustomed to the basic movement, you find yourself in the elevator shaft and walk onto a conveniently placed elevator roof, which leads to another cutscene with your captors and their prisoner. The captors speak of something called the Path and how they spent considerable effort to bring the stone hanging on Paddington's neck and him together, since apparently he is the only one who knows how to use it. The captors seem to want him to do something and call him their Lightbringer, though Paddington insinuates that whatever they are planning will not work, though the main captor seems unfazed by this. As the stone begins to glow, the fissures appear again, this time attacking the elevator, which seems to eat the younger of the captors. Soon the elevator falls and Edward manages to jump off, returning control to the player. Going further, you soon notice another issue with keyboard and mouse controls, as you face a ladder. In our now rather standard style, being close to the ladder has a new UI element appear, denoting that you can perform an action, and showing which button to use to perform said action. Unfortunately, unlike many more modern games, Alone in the Dark does not account for the multitude of keys that can be used on the PC, and instead resorts to using symbols denoting specific actions. Especially at this point in the game where the player is attempting to learn how to control the game, this isn't particularly a good thing, and if one hasn't looked at the key bindings menu in detail, might lead to just trying several buttons until something works. After climbing the ladder, you reach another dead end and have to use the action button to release a fire hose, which then leads to a somewhat interestingly built action scene. As you grab the hose, the tutorial pop-ups return, which should have happened at the ladder, considering how the UI displays the actions the player has to take, as these pop-ups are text-based, and display the specific key that has been bound to the required action. In this scene, you're tasked to use the hose to rappel down the elevator shaft in search of an entrance back into the building proper. While you use the basic controls to move Edward on the wall, you can also use the jump button to avoid obstacles, which is taught with another tutorial pop-up. As you go lower and things explode around you, you eventually reach another introductory segment, which takes advantage of the physics engine, as a power cable is detached from the wall, electrifying a metal grating you need to pass. To be able to move further, you're instructed to use Edward's body to push the cable onto an outcropping, which prevents the open end of the cable from making contact with the metal grating. Soon after this, the fissures reappear and you're directed to jump sideways to enter an opened elevator door, which changes the gameplay back into the third-person mode. Within the building, a slightly distressed woman called Anna asks for you to help her, as her colleague is hurt and locked behind a jammed door. Obviously, as the hero of the story, you're compelled to help, and so you go into the next room looking for an alternate route in. This segment teaches a few important lessons, first of which is an extension of the physics engine, as you're directed to grab a table and move it to clear a way forwards. In the next room, you're shown one of the more fascinating features of the game in the form of fire. Fire in the game isn't always merely a static thing that just exists, but actually spreads from one surface to another, with the structural integrity of the burning object lowering the longer the object burns. I actually really enjoy this kind of fire propagation mechanics, but unfortunately it also means your way into the room with the trapped man is now blocked. But as this is a tutorial, the solution to this problem is nearby, and the tutorial pop-ups direct you to pick up a fire extinguisher that has been conveniently placed next to the flames. This part at the latest should introduce one more quirk of the gameplay loop, as for the most part, you've been able to swap between first and third person modes at will, but in this sequence there are two opportunities to teach the player that this isn't always the case. The first of these moments comes as you're required to move the table, as entering the environmental interaction mode automatically changes the game into the third person view. The second of these moments comes as you pick up the fire extinguisher, as you're directed to use it to douse the flames. Pressing the shoot button to activate the extinguisher automatically changes into the first-person aiming mode. After having doused the flames, you can enter the room with a very annoyed and trapped man, and you're directed to take advantage of yet another new feature, which I'll be honest was the moment when I decided to change the controller for the remainder of the game. Alone in the Dark, the new Nightmare had a very cool feature where you could move the playable character's hand, allowing you to examine the world in more detail. Unfortunately, this wasn't utilized that much in the gameplay, and in fact there was only one puzzle in the entire game that properly took advantage of the feature. In a way, this feature returns in Alone in the Dark, as while in the third-person mode you can use the mouse or the right analog stick to move your hands, and by pressing the analog stick in one direction and then to the opposite, you perform a melee strike which is dependent on the directions pressed. In this segment, this feature is meant to be used to smash open a jammed door, which breaks down in a rather satisfying dynamic way the more you hit it with a fire extinguisher. The problem I faced was that the keyboard version of these controls is, to be completely frank, kind of ass. And it's rather obvious from this and the completely different fixed camera movement controls that the controls were primarily designed for the controller, and in the end I consider it to be the optimal way to actually play the game. Not only does using the controller feel better to me, but it also removes one annoyance I mentioned before, as the UI pop-ups showing possible actions you can take show the specific button icons while in the controller mode, instead of the non-specific action icons of the keyboard controls. After freeing the man from his bondage, the pair begins to argue, and the man respectfully disagrees with Anna about the existence of supernatural entities currently haunting the building.
Shut up, Anna! I'm growing sick and tired of your insane bullshit! Will you hurry? We don't have much time left.
But...
Anna, I told you to shut up!
You're told the only way out is through the now burning hallway, so you take your trusty fire extinguisher and douse even more flames until you reach a collapsed portion of the hallway where you're directed to jump across the chasm. This jump is accompanied by a very cinematic change in camera view, and as you reach the other side, more of the hallway begins to collapse, and you're directed to press another button to perform a quick turn. Doing so allows you to see the polite bald man being eaten by the ceiling as Anna runs away from the fissures. Having been cut off from the pair, you once more have no option but to move forwards, since one part of the hallway is currently on fire, and this time there's no fire extinguisher to be found. You're instead left with learning even more features. On the floor next to you is a corpse of a security guard and his sidearm. As you pick up the weapon, you're directed to equip it by opening the inventory screen, which shows a quick glimpse of what is to come later in the game, as the inventory is not merely a menu, but takes the form of Edward looking at the contents of his jacket in first-person view. Currently, there's not much to do with the inventory, as the only thing you have is the gun, but there is still some important information to be gathered, as while you're looking at the weapon at the top left of the screen you can see the currently remaining ammunition, and in the top center you have an icon depicting your currently equipped items. You're now armed with a simple weapon and are locked in a small corridor where one path is blocked by fire, one by a locked door, and one with debris, leading to a simple but effective way to put multiple things learned so far together. As the resolution to two of the parts are clearly unavailable, the only remaining option is to use the environmental destruction feature to shoot the lock of the door. I kinda like the office segment of the tutorial, as it shows many principles of design which imprint functions of the game into the player's mind quite effectively by taking advantage of not just the tutorial pop-ups that tell you what to do, but also by then repeating those scenarios in a slightly modified way without the same guidance, or by using environment itself as a learning experience. One such scenario happens as you enter through the doorway, and the game goes into cutscene mode, as one of the fissures attacks you, beginning to pull you inside of the building as you've seen happen to a couple of victims before. However, a burning beam detaches from the roof and crashes onto the fissure, causing it to scream in pain and withdraw, releasing you from its clutches, showing that there's at least something which seems to ward away these strange occurrences. Having been almost eaten by a building, you're now mildly injured, which the game announces in a very prominent tutorial pop-up. In the next rooms, you're introduced to even more environmental examination, as you're tasked to find a healing item. This can be done by examining the cupboards, opening which moves the view into the first-person mode, where you can examine the open cupboard to point the camera at objects, which you can then pick up with the action button. Once you've found a healing spray, you're directed to engage in what is called the healing mode. In this mode, you'll once more go into the first-person view, this time looking at your wounds, which are rather prominently displayed on the character. You also automatically have the healing spray equipped, which can then be exhausted to fully heal the targeted injuries. While in this moment there is no danger, the way in which healing works might already cause the player to realize some of the potential complications with the healing system, as the game does not seem to pause while you're healing yourself, and since you're looking down at yourself in the first-person mode, your capacity to keep track of your surroundings is severely limited until you're finished. This is a pretty good way to get the player to potentially consider future dangers in a safe environment. Once you have healed yourself, the fishes reappear and cause a rather major damage to the room you're in, which then leads to a quite spectacular demonstration of the environmental morphing capabilities of the game engine, as the entire room you're in begins to collapse around you, eventually throwing you outside, leaving you hanging on a grotesque as the camera pans to show the New York City Central Park. And finally, the title of the game. Even with the title drop, this is not yet what I consider the end of the tutorial, merely the end of the tutorial segment which introduces the basic concepts and functions of the gameplay, and as you fall down from your perch, the learning experiences continue. While falling, the game is in slight slow motion, and you're shown the context action UI element, pressing which grabs a hold of a hanging rope. If you miss this action, you merely fall to the balcony below and need to grab the rope from the ground. This rope functions identically to the elevator shaft sequence at the beginning, but you're taught another function of the rappelling system as you need to jump off the rope to reach a ledge with another survivor. The following tutorial segment is likely to properly reveal some curious aspects of the game design, which might come as either surprises or even disappointments for people who are fans of the survival horror genre. You're tasked to climb the facade of the collapsing building using the rappel mechanic and a newly introduced ledge climbing mechanic. The collapse of the building is heavily scripted and you're intended to take a specific path to your destination, which sometimes is very obvious and sometimes not so much. If you fail to choose the correct path, it's more than likely that you'll fall to your death. This, however, is not the end, and instead you're merely returned to a nearby checkpoint. At this point, the game seems to focus more on storytelling and individual set pieces you go through in a linear fashion, while the camera and the destructible environment are used to create a spectacle of the events surrounding the player. This is not exactly traditional survival horror design, and is instead closer to the kind of cinematic experience you'd find in a modern adventure game, mixed with sequences consisting of a gameplay more reminiscent of traditional survival horror action games. This wall climb sequence is a great example of this duality, as once you climb far enough the scene calms down and you find yourself locked within a partially collapsed portion of the building, within which you're tasked to use the physics engine to solve a puzzle that allows you to open up a path forwards. The duality in gameplay I do find interesting, as regardless of the quality of execution, I tend to appreciate it when developers have the courage to try something different. After another wall climbing spectacle, you reunite with Anna, who's managed to survive and find her way into another office. Breaking out of the room should at this point be routine, and as you reach the next room, the floor collapses and you're once more separated from Anna, who ends up being consumed by the fishes. The next sequence is again intended to get the player accustomed to problem solving by combining previously learned features, while introducing more complex mechanics little by little. In this case, you're trapped in a room with no exits, and the level above is out of your reach. Thankfully, you were taught how to move objects, so it's possible to move a table and use it to reach the platform above. This, however, is not enough, as your path forwards is now blocked by fire and electricity, requiring the usage of the ledge climbing mechanic taught just before, which allows you to reach a switch into which a live wire is connected so you can turn it off and open a pathway further. The way in which these set pieces have been crafted are, in my opinion, somewhat brilliant, as the slow but steady ramping up of complexity works well in teaching the player how to use all of the different gameplay mechanics in a somewhat heavy-handed but still intuitive way. In the next set piece, you're tasked with finding a pathway to a surviving security guard. The problem to be solved in this case is extreme darkness, which prevents you from seeing where the twisting and turning narrow pathway is, which leads to another very interesting mechanic. It was made clear earlier how fire propagates across different surfaces and objects. This can be taken advantage of, as next to a building wall is a conveniently placed wooden chair. By picking the chair up, you enter the object holding mode, similar to when it was necessary to use objects to break down doors blocking your path. In this mode, it's possible to point the chair in different directions, including pushing it into the fire, which causes the fire propagation system to light the chair on fire. Once the chair is lit, you can move around the chair to light your way, as you also notice the limited time you have while the fire on the chair keeps spreading closer and closer to your hands. As you reach the security guard, he notices that Anna has also found her way here, though as the guard nears her, she turns around and is shown to be covered in what look like smaller versions of the fishes on the walls. Once she's finished with the guard, she turns her attention to Edward, revealing more about an apparent connection with the events and our amnesiac protagonist.
She's one of my hosts now, as you once were. You, my most perfect puppet.
After this shocking revelation, you're given an option to save, while the end credits play in the background. At this point, it should not come as a surprise that Alone in the Dark is quite linear, instead of trying to be similar to the original Alone in the Dark games, or even similar to other more modern survival horror titles. This one was made to be a different beast altogether. I already mentioned the combination of different types of gameplay, such as the mixture of spectacle set pieces and more traditional puzzle gameplay sequences, but that is not the only way Alone in the Dark has been segmented. As was a bit of a trend for a while, Alone in the Dark is episodic, which is reflected in many of the design choices, going so far as to some elements of the options menus. While saving, you have only one slot, which can understandably feel very restrictive, but how the episodic nature's been implemented makes the save slot kind of a moot point anyway. If you feel like you've not done something correctly or that you missed something in a previous set piece, you can simply go into the pause menu and into the very VHS player style window to simply rewind to an earlier segment. Similarly, in the main menu, you can browse through the chapters and choose from which of the unlocked chapters you'd want to continue from. If you do so, you're treated to a television show style previously on segment, which plays clips from the earlier chapters to give somewhat of an idea on where in the story you're continuing from. I honestly never understood the fascination with trying to emulate a television show style structure with video games, especially since one of the best parts of games is that they're so unlike television shows, as you can kinda create your own story within the confines of the scripted experience due to the interactive nature of the medium. Why this implementation is in my opinion not the best is that the spectacle set piece deaths instantly loading a checkpoint and the ability to constantly rewind or even skip sequences really do diminish the amount of tension the gameplay sequences can create, as many portions can feel very consequence-free. Having a very strict saving system in the fashion of most survival horror games would have in my opinion worked well for the game. Sure, it would have been frustrating for many, but it also would have allowed for the spectacle set pieces to build up more of the kind of tension they're clearly meant to build, but which they effectively cannot do because of this lack of consequences. The second episode begins with the now possessed Anna attacking you, which then leads to a combat tutorial. To help with your fight, multiple objects are lying around the arena, including a katana, signifying that this apartment once belonged to a reaction streamer. The fight itself takes advantage of features already learned, albeit now in a more dangerous situation, as attacking is done by pushing the right analog stick from one direction to another, just as it worked while bashing in doors. One additional feature is introduced in the form of a lock-on mechanic, which can be used while wielding something that can be used as a weapon by holding the appropriate button. Learning how to use these features together means you can beat down the possessed Anna with relative ease. But this is not all. Beating an enemy senseless is not enough to truly defeat them, something which was already alluded to earlier in the tutorial where a fisher attempted to eat Edward. Instead, to fully defeat an enemy, it's necessary to burn them using whatever sources of fire available. Not every object you pick up can be lit on fire, however, and to help figure out which object can be used for what, the pickup UI element has little icons which show the features of the object being targeted, such as if they are breakable and if they can be lit on fire. I find this to be a rather good way to continue the ramping up of the complexity, since almost every feature needed in this tutorial fight has already been learned before. How to pick up objects and how to strike with them was demonstrated while needing to break down doors, and the nature of burnable objects and how to manipulate those objects was taught at the end of the previous episode in the pitch black room. Now in this fight, those features need to be put together to effectively combat the possessed threat. After the battle, you're introduced to even more environmental hazards with a rather simple timed jump, after which you enter yet another elevator to find another survivor. This time an art dealer called Sarah Flores, who seems unaware of the supernatural events going on in the building. This changes rather quickly as more possessed attack the elevator, causing it to crash down. Thankfully, the pair survives this crash and finds themselves on the ground floor where the power's gone out, and creatures are attacking the few remaining survivors. As you exit the elevators, you find a very useful new item, a flashlight, which can be equipped from the inventory menu. Exploring the area allows you to find even more items, including a bottle of flammable liquid. One interesting aspect of the inventory system is that you can equip different items in your left and right hands. For example, having the flashlight on your left hand and the gun in your right, which can obviously be a useful combination while exploring dark areas and still having some means to defend yourself. While not in the inventory mode, you can use the shoulder buttons in the controller mode to scroll through the items equipable in that hand. One of these objects is the bottle of liquid you may have found. Having likely found multiple other items so far, the segmentation of the inventory menu should now be clearly visible. On the left side of your jacket are 5 slots into which smaller objects are stored, such as your ammunition and batteries, while in the middle you have your weapon, and on the right side are 4 larger items such as bottles. Here you can use a combine function on some of these objects. These include rather basic things such as loading your weapon with more ammunition or putting new batteries into the flashlight. But that is not all. You can also combine more mundane items into things that can be used as weapons. Since the enemies are supernatural beings that seem to be only defeated by fire, your gun is not particularly effective at defeating most of the enemies. Yes, you can cause enough damage to stun the enemies for a short period of time, but they will not be completely destroyed. This is why the bottles can be very useful, as throwing one and shooting it with a gun can be used as an effective means of fighting the possessed. In addition to that, the bottles can be enhanced by combining them with more items, such as using double-sided tape to create a sticky bomb. I actually really enjoy this system, even if the limited amount of space in the jacket inventory means that the player might have to be very specific about which items they want to carry with them and which to leave behind. The lobby introduces a new type of enemy, a smaller arachnoid being which follows slightly different rules from the previously met enemies, as unlike the possessed who can only be killed with fire, the small arachnids can be completely defeated with your gun. If you do choose to use your weapon, this fighting sequence also introduces the very slight auto-aim feature. The sequence also introduces 2 different types of minigames, the first of which is a jump-starting minigame in which you're tasked to turn on the cut power by bringing 2 wires close together to create an arc of electricity, but without having the wires touch each other, something which is relatively simple with a dual analog control scheme. The second is using a keypad to open a locked door, which follows the kind of diegetic design many of the other aspects of the game has done as well. And instead of it merely being a menu, you move Edward's hand across the keypad to press the buttons. The puzzle aspect in this is rather simple, as you need to find a 3-digit code, and there are bloody fingerprints on the keypad, so you know the numbers, just not the order. Eventually, you'll reach the parking garage where you find the hurt Paddington, who managed to escape from your captors. He talks of some ritual which damaged Edward's memories, and also mentions someone called Crowley, and someone who's behind all of the chaos who you've been experiencing. He explains that this Crowley is the one who wants the stone, and how now that someone called he is free, the crew must follow a path of light to stop him before the entire city is destroyed. Still being very confused about the details, you realize you're still in danger and have to find a way out of this mess. Since you're in a garage, the obvious option is to steal a car and use that to escape. While in the car, you can swap seats and look around to interact with different parts of the vehicle, including using knowledge taught by John Connor to actually start the car in an easy way. This then leads to another spectacle sequence where you get to drive around the garage while the possessed are after you, and everything keeps collapsing around you. The driving controls for the controller are rather standard, with one trigger being used for acceleration and the other one for braking. Eventually though, your path is blocked once more and you need to continue on foot. However, as the garage has collapsed around you, you need to take advantage of yet another new feature to open a path forwards. In a storage room, you can find a lighter, which might also reveal the very limited amount of space available in your jacket inventory, potentially forcing you to drop an item, as without the lighter you cannot continue, since the next segments are in fact a nice little tutorial examining more of the fire propagation mechanic. As you enter the area, you may have noticed a context action pop up with a lighter as its icon. This is because the car you crashed ruptured its gas tank and let out a stream of fuel, which can be lit by using any source of fire. If you do so, the fire quickly spreads through the entire line of fuel, eventually reaching the car, which explodes and clears a passage forwards. The next room is very similar, and your pathway is once more blocked, but this time by beams of wood, leading to the very simple deduction that these two must be burnt to proceed further. Once you do so, the fissures return, and if you're caught, you're forced to engage in the first somewhat clunky QTE of the game to release yourself from its clutches. Eventually, the crew finds another car, which they use to finally find their way outside, where it's revealed the fissures and the destruction following them are spread across the entire city. Something massive seems to be moving under the ground, like a massive fissure, which Paddington calls the epicenter and says that this is what he released Edward from, and how it wants the stone back. As this massive fissure is after you, Paddington tells you to escape and drive into the park as fast as possible, leading into another spectacle scene. This time of you driving across the collapsing city, avoiding other cars, falling debris, and driving through buildings as you try to survive. Even in this scene, the driving controls, at least on the controller, feel pretty decent. And if there's one aspect of the scene I would criticize, it's that there is relatively little room for error, and if you're caught by the epicenter, you're forced to retry the entire driving sequence from the very beginning. Still, I do admit that I actually enjoyed this sequence. The environmental morphing is actually pretty fantastic for the time, and even if a high-speed chase through a city isn't exactly traditional survival horror, I appreciate the pure cool factor of having an epic choir ringing out as you Blues Brothers yourself through a mall. As you reach Central Park, your vehicle is disabled, and the crew must proceed further on foot, but not before Paddington engages in some more exposition. The stone around his neck begins to glow, and he explains that Edward must find his way to the museum and proceed on the path of light that he's prepared to do for his entire life. He hands over the stone, explaining it's now mostly harmless, but that it can still be used in some way. Then Paddington explains that Edward should meet him at the museum, after which he commits a Sudoku, making the statement about meeting him very confusing for now. As episode 3 begins, even more features are introduced as the crash did manage to wound Edward, and he's bleeding profusely. While you're bleeding, a new UI element appears, showing a timer depicting how much time you have until you bleed out. Sarah considers your bleeding to be a problem, and she chases after an ambulance, separating the pair. As she leaves, Paddington's phone rings, leading Edward to gain a new toy. The caller is Crowley, the head of the captors at the beginning, and the only thing of relevance he seems to say is that he's very salty that you have the stone instead of him. Obtaining the phone opens up several new features, the main one being the phone menu that can now be opened with the select button. In this menu there are several sub-menus, one of which contains text messages. For now, these serve two purposes, the first of which is giving a little bit more exposition about the relationship between Paddington and Crowley, and the second is a message category which basically acts as a manual, describing in detail what you can do with each item you can pick up from the world. The settings menu allows you to change the ringtone settings and whether to display a minimap on the main gameplay screen, and some details about how the map is displayed. You can also check your contacts and examine a full map of Central Park. For now though, you're meant to use the final menu in which you can dial a number, which in this case should be the emergency number, where a rather annoyed person answers and tells you to go to a public restroom where you should be able to find a first aid kit. After the phone call, you might notice yet another feature in the form of objective markers on the minimap, as one has now appeared displaying the direction you need to head to find the restroom. Unfortunately, as you go towards the marker, the game unleashes the most feared enemy of the entire history of gaming, cliff racers. Reaching the restroom starts a sequence which I consider to be the end of the tutorial, though since most of the teaching has been pretty well integrated with the gameplay, it's actually not exactly clear where the tutorial is intended to end, as most of the gameplay after the very beginning doesn't really feel like one. In a linear game like this, I actually appreciate how the segments that can be considered tutorials are peppered across the beginning in easily consumable segments, instead of it having a very long and obvious tutorial after which the game truly feels like it begins. Why I consider this to be the end of the tutorial, however, is because you're taught a few more expansions of previously learned mechanics. The first task is to find bandages that can be used to stop Edward from bleeding to death. In practice, this works identically to healing with a medical spray, just with a different item and for a different type of wound. As you enter the room with the first aid kit, a live wire separated from the roof, blocking your way out, leading to another lesson about even more things you can break with your weapon, allowing you to release cables and such from their holdings. Leaving the restroom is also the final moment when you're required to learn a lesson that you could have learned earlier by doing some experimentation with found items, something I mentioned during the lobby segment. As the cliff racers have jammed the door leading outside and you're required to use the items lying around to blow up a segment of the wall to create a new exit. One interesting part about throwable explosives is that if you have both a bottle and a weapon equipped, once you throw a bottle, you are put into a shooting mode where Edward automatically follows the trajectory of the bottle, allowing you to explode it at any point during its arc. Even if you do not do so, you can still manually aim at the explosive bottles once they've reached their destination to blow them up. At this point, you might also realize that there are multiple possible combinations of items that can be used, especially if you've read the loading screen tips or the text message segment explaining the functions of the objects you've found. Since the inventory menu is not the fastest to use and the game is not paused while in inventory, there are 4 slots that can be used to set item combinations that can then be equipped by using the Quick Equip function while outside of the inventory menu. Having blown up the wall, you see more of the destruction wrought by the epicenter, as it seems like the entire Central Park is now isolated from the rest of the city by a massive, seemingly bottomless chasm. Since you have little choice, it's time to use all you've learned to open up a pathway forwards while navigating the cliffside. Very early on, another feature is introduced, as the pop-up explains that you can draw your pistol out while you're hanging on a wire, something which is required to continue forwards. During this cliffside sequence, you're occasionally harassed by even more cliff races, which as smaller enemies can be destroyed with bullets alone. Eventually you'll reach a bus teetering on a ledge, which is a small set piece taking advantage of the physics engine, as you need to move bodies to act as a counterbalance to prevent the bus from falling off the cliff. This sequence also introduces the first time you're required to fight multiple possessed enemies at once, acting as yet another escalation of complexity and difficulty of things already learned. To me, the entire Cliffside sequence represents a kind of training segment happening after the tutorials have ended, as you're going through multiple small set pieces which all tend to take advantage of taught features, while adding a little twist into how those features have been implemented. Whether it's the bus segment with a physics engine, the combat arena with multiple enemies, or a door that needs to be broken, but one which is on the ceiling instead of the wall, culminating with a final segment where a giant fleshy mass blocks your progress, requiring the usage of explosives to burn it down, many of which are conveniently placed in the room below the mass. The Cliffside is a great example of the kind of teaching Alone in the Dark is full of, and I appreciate it when games have been built in a way where the player manages to intuitively apply what they've learned with a minimal direct guidance from the game. Going past the mast, you find yourself in the best part of every video game, the sewer segment. Though to be fair, this time it's mostly not that bad. Before you can engage with the wonders of the New York sewage system, Crowley calls you, calling you Carnby, and teasing you that he could help you with your memories. The following segments continue the kind of increasing of complexity the player should at this point be very familiar with, as your route is blocked by electrified water, and it's necessary to engage in yet another fuse box minigame. This time with an added layer of difficulty, as there are two lights on the box which turn on and off rhythmically, and to not get damaged, the wires need to be sparked while the light is green. Similarly, there is a ledge climb sequence, but that as well has an added layer, with pipes blowing steam that need to be avoided, followed by some more toying around with the physics engine to open another pathway. Soon enough, even more features are introduced, the first of which actually fits the name of the franchise, as you find a hallway filled with strange goo that seems to only exist in the darkness, leading to a sequence which can get moderately annoying as you try to use your flashlight to push away the darkness while avoiding being eaten by it. After this hallway, a modification of an earlier feature appears. To enter the sewers, it was necessary to destroy a fleshy mass using fire, and in this room you find another fleshy mass which periodically spits out the smaller arachnid enemies. These as well have received an update, and a variation of the creatures makes an appearance, one which can spit in your face, finally requiring the usage of the blink mechanic introduced at the very beginning of the game. Knowing that it's been a while, the pop-ups actually remind the player of the existence of the feature. Having passed yet another field of hungry darkness, you find a municipal worker and a bunch of cliff racers trying to attack you. But since you're protected by a chain link fence, the worker suggests an idea which takes advantage of the environmental manipulation features, and you can pull an electric cable near the fence and then activate it, electrifying the fence and roasting the cliff racers. This is a very nice modification of the feature, as previously it has merely been a hazard for you to avoid, but now it's shown that the same hazards can sometimes be used against the enemies. Finally, you find an exit out of the sewers and you receive a cryptic text message from Crowley, who decided to send you a report about a monastery massacre in the 1940s, which apparently has something to do with the stone you're carrying. Now out of the sewers, you actually get to explore Central Park, either by foot or by using one of the several vehicles that can be found abandoned across the park. While your primary purpose is still to reach the next objective marker, there are some side areas that can be explored for more equipment, which would be even more useful if there were more slots in your inventory. The park itself has many dangers, including a new larger version of the Possessed, which doesn't seem to stagger from your melee attacks in a similar fashion that the smaller Possessed do, though they are still just as susceptible to fire as their weaker counterparts. To actually reach your objective requires the usage of explosions, manipulating the environment with the physics features, and just driving like a maniac, which allows you to reach the ambulance where a doctor and Sarah are waiting for you. Since you finally know your full name, the doctor punches it into the database, and while the search is processing, he takes care of your wounds. Once the database search is complete, the doctor believes he's made a mistake, since the records seem to indicate something which seems completely impossible, as the only Edward Carnby found has been missing since the 1930s, over a decade after he solved the mystery of the Dorsetto Manor where Jeremy Hartwood died.
You're kidding. I don't mean you're like 100 years old.
The way in which Alone in the Dark reveals information little by little is actually pretty interesting to me, and the revelation that this game isn't actually a full reboot but a continuation of the story of the original Edward Carnby, I honestly didn't expect. As your goal is still to reach the museum, you're given a task to reach a car, and before you reach a said vehicle, you're also given a properly good reason to explore some areas outside of the beaten path, as you find a new weapon just sitting on a table, once and for all proving that you indeed are in the United States of America. This new gun replaces your old one and uses the same pool of ammunition, acting as a direct vertical upgrade, giving you more damage per shot. Reaching the car, you're once more ambushed by a pack of cliff racers and another chase scene ensues. What differentiates this driving sequence from the previous ones are the cliff racers which constantly attack your car, and if enough of them accumulate onto the vehicle, they begin to lift it off the ground, which obviously is a slight detriment to being able to steer. To get rid of the winged menaces, you need to either drive really well, managing to keep a good top speed, or really poorly, so the crashing throws the creatures off. Eventually, a tree falls and blocks your path, leading the creatures to fly you into a courtyard, where a giant fleshy mass seems to act as the source of the cliff racer menace. In essence, this is a boss fight where you need to avoid objects being thrown by the swarm, while using items scattered around the arena to burn down the fleshy mass. After the fight, Crowley contacts you once more, revealing some aspects of what the goal seems to be, as he says he will not let Carnby waste a part of the stone on a prophecy which includes bringing back the Lightbringer, which as Sarah assumes could be an English version of the name Lucifer, which would make this the only universe where chick tracts are actually a reality. This leads to the next free roam segment, where you can either go towards the main goal objective marker or do some more exploration. Checking the map, you can see multiple circles of static in the nearby area, clearly signifying some kind of an area of importance. Exploring these areas, you find that your minimap also becomes staticky while you're in the area. You also begin to hear strange constant humming, which seems to be emanating from weird roots that have sprouted from the ground. As you get closer to these roots, your vision becomes extremely wavy, almost like you were getting an oral migraine. As you may have guessed, these roots can be burned, and as you do, you find out that there are some benefits for doing so. Not only does burning the roots remove the static, you also gain points in what is called Spectral Vision, and gaining a few points upgrades that ability. The Spectral Vision functions by closing your eyes, which after this initial destruction of the roots can be used to see the weak points of enemies. And if upgraded even more during this free roam segment, those weak points remain visible for a short while after opening your eyes. Once you've had enough of exploration and you reach the next objective marker, you're faced with a simple vehicular puzzle, where it's required to create a ramp out of a towing vehicle that can then be used to do a sick jump over a chasm and onto the plateau on which the museum resides. Unfortunately for our protagonists, the cliff racers return again, this time kidnapping Sarah and leaving Edward to complete this little task alone. Reaching the museum brings back the moving fissures, though this time in a slightly different way, as all of the previous encounters with the fissures were merely tutorials intended to prepare the player for this moment, where they need to actively fight the fissure while avoiding it or be sucked in and have to complete the QTE to escape its clutches. The next segments add even more complexity to already learned features, as to even be able to enter the museum, you need to complete yet another fuse box minigame. Yet this time there are multiple wires that can be changed with the up and down controls of each hand, changing the minigame from a mere find the right distance to also being about the right combination of wires. Inside the museum, you'll also face a new type of enemy, a large creature that throws blades at you. Since this creature hides behind a wall of flames, it's also possible to notice an interesting feature of Alone in the Dark while you're getting more equipment to try and survive, and also kill the being. Things inside containers seem to respawn periodically. Considering some gameplay sequences, this feature makes all the sense, but also means that for those expecting a so-called pure survival horror experience, this is yet another sign that you'll definitely not get that out of this game. If you decide to fight this being up close, one feature is bound to make itself clear. At this point, it's very likely you figure out the flame-throwing combinations are very powerful against enemies. The regular possessed seem to be destroyed with a very short burst of fire which lights up their fissure, leading to their demise. However, these larger enemies don't initially seem to follow that logic, and instead the fissures at the front merely turn a different color. This is because some enemies have multiple of their fissures, and all of them need to be lit up for the enemy to be defeated. And in this one of them is on its back, clearly meant to act as a lesson for this specific feature. Soon enough, you finally reach Sarah, who's been encased in some kind of a fleshy cocoon. Thankfully, the situation is far less dire than it seems to be, as a simple swing of an axe releases her and brings up a Final Fantasy VII style minigame where you're giving her CPR. Once you've saved her by completing the somewhat clunky minigame, you're introduced to a completely unnecessary romance subplot, before you get to continue exploring the museum while trying to find a way into the room where Paddington said he would meet up with Edward. The subsequent exploration forces the player to take advantage of many other features learned before, with multiple enemies and the watery darkness being obstacles that need to be passed. There are also segments which might force the player to get out of their already learned comfort zone, as they may have already found favorite item combinations to use. But there are puzzle areas which require very specific solutions to be completed. The part that makes some of these sequences more annoying than they should be are the respawning enemies which constantly act as an obstacle. Eventually, your path is blocked by a gate and a handprint sensor, on the other side of which you meet another survivor, a security guard who seems familiar with Paddington. He guides you towards another entry into the area he's in and reaches past the gate to open another doorway with a handprint sensor. Obviously, nothing can go right in the world of Edward Carnby, and instead of moving further into the museum's bowels, something seems to shake the entire building, and the elevator you're in stops before it properly begins to move, and you have to climb out into the same room you tried to leave. This time though, the entire room-wide gate is gone, and in its place a massive creature climbing on the walls. This creature seems to be judging you for your sins, saying it's irrelevant that you don't remember them, that your defiant attitude is an admittance to your guilt in all of those deaths. What deaths? Absolutely no idea. Regardless, you now have to engage in another boss fight, once more taking advantage of items lying around the room, while you can use the spectral vision to see the spots where you need to burn the massive monster. Interestingly, the enemy is not merely a combination of multiple previously met enemies, but also has special attacks where you need to use cover to avoid an attack, as well as it being able to destroy said cover, leaving you less room to maneuver. Soon enough though, you kill the beast and Sarah catches up with you, quickly proving that she is also very pragmatic, as your path is once more blocked with a handprint sensor, and the guard is now very much dead. However, that doesn't mean he can't give you a hand. The next portions don't really introduce anything new, and eventually you reach the room you were looking for, where strange phenomena begin to happen. If you weren't keen on doing some side exploring earlier, this is where you'll finally learn about the spectral vision mechanic, as Paddington indeed does meet you here, albeit in a ghostly form only seen in the spectral vision mode. Following his directions, you engage in some percussive maintenance and enter a dream world where Paddington finally speaks. He explains that since Lucifer's banishment, he created the stone to maintain his soul until the time would be right. Those who carry the stone seem to have a life eternal, but also begin to be negatively influenced by Lucifer's presence, and for some reason he released Lucifer from the stone. He also says that he entered this dimension willingly because there is a war raging taking place in all of the dimensions, and that Carnby must learn the secrets of Central Park, one of which can lead to salvation. Despite still not having a massive amount to go on, having Lucifer free and searching for the stone you possess doesn't sound like a particularly good thing, so you move forwards to a secret room, where you find more documents and a lens which seems important. In the documents, you find a poem of sorts, which seems like a prophecy, where the hands of Venus will fashion a lock while Mars fights to bring back the key. There is also a passage about the two becoming one, which is one of the biggest aspects of true horror so far, as it might imply a cringy 2000s sex scene. Regardless, you also learn about the Templars, not to be confused with the Templars, who have apparently built a bunch of things around Central Park for some purpose, and knew how to use light as a kind of physical force. This and the lens are a clue on what to do next, as using the lens focuses the light to a certain shape, which then can be used to open up a new pathway forwards, from whence you might find a way into an old castle where the lens needs to be used to reveal the location of the key, while Sarah stays behind to study Paddington's notes and construct the lock. The next area is in essence a crash course into how a forklift works in the game, as to move further each small area requires the usage of the forklift in a slightly different way. In one room, it's also sensible to use a feature which seems kinda silly, as it's possible to pour fuel on your weapon, which then causes it to shoot flaming bullets. Very video gamey, but extremely useful in several circumstances. Once you find yourself back outside, you fall into a pit full of the gooey and deadly darkness. Taking advantage of the situation, Crowley makes his appearance in a helicopter demanding you hand over the stone, resulting in a sequence where you need to follow the floodlight of the helicopter to not get eaten by the goo. Finally giving up, Edward promises to hand over the stone in exchange for being rescued from this predicament. Once on board the helicopter, Edward demands answers from Crowley, who seems to want the stone for his own selfish purposes, proving once and for all that a promising villain is merely yet another South African billionaire.
Happy endings are for fools! To hell with mankind! I was born to carry that stone!
As tends to be the case every time you find yourself outside, your nice little chat is cut short by the appearance of cliff racers. This time a massive one, which I assume to be the mummy cliff racer angry at you for killing its spawn. Obviously, this doesn't bode well for your adventure, and the helicopter crashes with you hanging on a rope, leading to another spectacle set piece, where you avoid debris until you find yourself on not-so-stable ground again, and have to fight against multiple enemies until you climb into the now-dead giant cliff racer's anus, only to find yourself back in Central Park. Reaching the old castle is the point where you would at the latest be introduced to the Spectral Vision upgrade mechanic, as you receive a message telling you that you need to find the mysterious roots and upgrade your vision to a certain point which will allow you to proceed. You're also told these roots are connected to an evil tree, and perhaps destroying enough of these roots will lower the defenses of said tree. This then means you now enter a mandatory free roam sequence where you need to find and destroy several of the evil roots. Having done so, your spectral vision now allows you to see alchemist symbols of the Templars, which in practice are the same symbols seen in the museum, where one was drawn on the wall with red paint and used to open a pathway into the caverns below. In practice, this opens up a kind of puzzle sequence where you need to go around the old castle while closing your eyes to locate the symbols, and then use the flashlight and lens combination to activate each of the symbols while occasionally fighting enemies. Once you reach the top of the castle, you receive a call from Sarah, who's been doing some more reading, something which has been relatively obvious during the free roam segment, as she's been periodically sending you text messages about what she's learned. This time it was important enough to warrant a call, as she's found that the person who reaches the end of the path of light will end up calling Lucifer to Earth, and then they have to make a choice which will decide the fate of humanity. Unfortunately, the text isn't particularly clear about what kind of a choice this is or what will lead to the salvation of humanity. At the top of the castle, using the lens and telescope together finally reveals the secret of Central Park, and you now have a direction to your final goal. As the final episode begins, even more of the roots have sprouted, and it's possible to once more roam freely around the park, destroying more and more of them, which is also likely to show one of the negative aspects of the limited inventory space. The more fighting there is, the quicker you'll obviously run out of items to use, and many parts of the park aren't particularly packed with items. Knowing that items in containers respawn, that does mean that you do have an infinite supply of items. They are just scattered around the park, and the kinds of items you really want might not always be nearby. This is obviously intended to be a part of the survival horror element, but the free roam aspect and the knowledge of respawning items means it's not a particularly successful element, as it's likely that many players would just see their resources dwindle and take a car to another part of the park to spawn camp a container where the specific kind of item is located. While the inventory space and item amount seem pretty well balanced for the more linear exploration segments, in the free roam, especially at this point with multiple route locations, the amount of space just feels too limited, and trying to acquire more items became a little bit tedious at this point. Your objective to enter the secret of the park is blocked by Lucifer's evil tree, and its impenetrable shield, which can only be seen by upgrading your spectral vision enough. Thankfully, despite its monstrous appearance, the tree falls to the same tricks you're likely to have mastered at this point, and burning the unsettling plant finally allows you to proceed, as long as you've upgraded your spectral vision to a point where you can open the next path forwards. Within the hidden caverns, you find a massive construction which is clearly the handiwork of the alchemists, as the entire layout is the shape of the symbol you've seen around the park. This segment is a collection of trials, or puzzles, that need to be completed in order to progress, and they take advantage of multiple different mechanics involving fire, light, and timing. At the end of your trials, you finally find the key, an ancient man called Hermes, who explains that a millennia ago he was also a carrier of the stone, and having realized it had deceived him, he split the stone in two, crippling Lucifer's power. Now, with the pieces of the stone being together by the actions of the true carrier Edward, the prophecy can be completed, and the decision which will change the world can be made. As the two reach Central Park again, Sarah calls Edward, informing that as the lock was completed, some kind of a mechanism began to automatically lock it, and the two only have a limited amount of time to reach the museum and complete the prophecy. This then leads to yet another car chase sequence through the park as Sarah updates you on the progress of the mechanism, while you need to avoid a massive root sprouting from the ground. Once you reach the museum, you're reminded of the existence of our South African billionaire who's now taken Sarah as a hostage, but thankfully that problem has a simple solution.
Starting to piss me off, Crowley.
Let go of me, you bastard!
After which, Hermes can finally complete his ritual to activate the mechanism in the spiral room, opening up a path into a hidden chamber. This massive chamber contains a temple which Hermes says he constructed with the help of many others, being inspired by the stone, thinking it would be a gift for all mankind. He explains that this is a connection between worlds and a doorway that Lucifer can use to enter our world. He directs you to place your half of the stone onto the pedestal, which then activates the device connecting the two halves. This action begins to open the portal between the worlds, and with the stone now complete, Hermes tells you to pick it up and face Lucifer himself. As you grab the stone, Lucifer begins to manifest through you, but Sarah interrupts this by taking the stone for herself. Hermes gives you a choice: either kill Sarah or spare her. In gameplay terms, this final decision allows you to choose from two endings. If you shoot Sarah, Edward ends up being possessed by Lucifer, as Hermes' words imply the future of humanity is not particularly bright.
The last free act of man was murder.
Despite Hermes' protestation about humanity being there to fight against Lucifer, Lucifer also implies that more will come through the portal as the end credits begin to roll. If you choose not to kill Sarah, however, the ending is even shorter, and Lucifer is reincarnated in her body instead. But instead of having supernatural power, she merely taunts Edward, and how he still hasn't regained his memories.
What will you do now? Kill me? How does it feel to be so alone?
With Paddington and Sarah now lost, he's truly alone in this world. Something which Edward is now used to, as he walks away and the credits roll. I wish I could properly explain these endings, but I can only give my interpretations. Since the endings themselves don't really explain much, and most of the information about the entire situation are given through text messages from Sarah during the free roam segments, it's clear that the entirety of the events were planned by Lucifer, but there are some aspects which I'm not entirely sure about. All of the devices of the alchemist were inspired by Lucifer, so their purpose must also have been a part of his plan. It makes complete sense that he would tempt people into building a portal between worlds, through which he could fully be reincarnated on Earth once more, as now he can only extend his power in a more limited fashion. This limited fashion includes having used Edward as a means of causing death and destruction here and there for 70 years after he took possession of the stone, something which was ended before the game began, as Paddington seems to have exorcised Lucifer from both Edward and the stone, leading Edward being free, but also giving Lucifer more freedom to extend his power, causing the calamities seen during the game. What I'm not entirely sure about is the locking device outside the portal chamber. Considering the effects and sounds, if you fail to reach the chamber in time, it seems like the device causes a massive explosion. This leads me to question its purpose. Is it just a way for Lucifer to ensure his future host is the correct one? And if the carrier of the stone fails, he'll die and Lucifer will be once more bound to the stone. This to me seems the only viable choice, since if Lucifer's purpose is to be reincarnated, why would he try to stop people from reaching the device before it completes its purpose? Unless it is some kind of a test to ensure the host for the reincarnation is strong enough. This would also then explain more of the ending, as if you fail, Lucifer would just have to wait for another carrier, and the entire process would repeat itself, shown by Crowley and his crew, who seem to be a more modern reincarnation of the alchemists, who believe the stone could be used for their personal benefit, which would inevitably lead to the construction of a new portal and a new device, making Crowley the future Hermes. As for the two endings themselves, based on the little scene, and what can be read from all the messages during the game, it seems like Lucifer requires the true carrier as his host for reincarnation to possess all of his powers after rebirth. This is why when Edward becomes the host, Lucifer immediately begins to show off his powers, whereas if Sarah becomes the host, she seems more decayed and weak, and shows no signs of having any supernatural powers. This possibility is reflected in the final clue to the choice you need to make, as the prophecy also states that Lucifer's greatest defeat comes at his greatest victory. So yes, Lucifer was reincarnated, but in an incompatible body devoid of supernatural powers. As much as I like thinking about things like these, I can also understand completely why the endings would feel very lackluster, as the endings themselves explain very little and leave most of the things up for interpretation. One thing that to me was a missed opportunity was the potential to subvert expectations. Since the themes of Lucifer and the end of the world are very commonly known tropes of Western mythology, where the lines of good and evil have been drawn in a way to immediately cause a specific kind of interpretation. Sometimes those stories are the best when they subvert these tropes, which Alone in the Dark seemed like it could have been building up to, as the nature and source of many of the beings attacking you wasn't initially that clear, even so far as the creature which was chastising Edward for his sins. I think a more effective revelation would have been that the sides we understand perhaps aren't as we were led to believe, and it wasn't Lucifer attempting to thwart your progress after all, Similarly to how another game I will eventually make a video about somewhere in the future missed an opportunity to recontextualize our expectations. There is a bit of an issue with the story pacing, as the beginning of the game heavily features the aspect of Edward's amnesia, while little by little revealing some details about his life and the other characters, but around the midpoint of the story, this aspect is almost completely dropped, and even Crowley disappears as an antagonist for most of the game, while the story focuses on the main quest of trying to stop the chaos going on in Central Park. This is related to an issue where the developers made some of the same decisions that were made during the development of Alone in the Dark: The New Nightmare. As it's obvious that many of the questions raised by the game, such as most events of the 70-year gap during which Edward was missing under the influence of the stone, might have gotten answers in a sequel. And especially the ending where Edward is possessed very heavily teasing a sequel and an escalation of the conflict that struck Earth.
Did you think I'd come alone?
Unfortunately, neither of the games received a sequel, meaning both had multiple well-telegraphed pieces of story that never went anywhere. Once more showing that you should always make a piece of media in a way where you don't assume a sequel will happen, or you might leave the enjoyers of said media hanging dry and feeling unsatisfied. Regardless, I did enjoy what of the story exists, even if they could have been more clear about some aspects of the storyline and left fewer strands hanging. I was still very much engrossed in learning more about the world and the people, and finding out the connections between the original trilogy and this one was actually pretty cool, even if the tone of the writing is sometimes very painfully 2000s.
I'm the light bringer! I'm the fucking universe!
The game itself is actually not at all bad. Alone in the Dark can feel like a bad game if you expect a survival horror experience, because that's definitely not what the game is. It's more of a horror adventure game, similar to Quantic Dream style games, except with more traditional gameplay. Aside from a couple of free roam segments, most of the gameplay is very linear, and there's very little exploration and practically no backtracking. This also means that there are barely any puzzle items that can be carried in your inventory, and most puzzles are instead within the environment. The action set pieces themselves are pretty spectacular, and the destruction engine is actually pretty fantastic. Even the driving sequences are pretty fun, even though there are occasionally some interesting physics anomalies. The destruction engine is also used in fairly interesting ways, especially combined with the fire propagation mechanic, both of which play an important role in many of the puzzles during gameplay. The largest kind of negative aspect of both of these mechanics is that they could have fine-tuned some of the values used within the programming, as while I appreciate having to break down doors and other things with physical force, and burning items or dousing fires, sometimes these actions just take a little bit too long, making the action feel more like padding than an actual cool feature. One of the aspects I appreciate the most is how tutorials have been implemented within the gameplay. Since there is quite a large variety of things that can be done, and many of the set pieces have something that's only going to be used once, or expanded upon later in a different way, there isn't just one tutorial which is clearly a tutorial, but instead the developers have peppered in small educational set pieces within the gameplay, making the learning feel much more organic instead of being just a tutorial after which you're thrown into the fray. Where this shows the most is in the item combination mechanics, where little by little the complexity of what you need to do with the items is ramped up in a way where it doesn't feel like the game is trying to hold your hand, but instead leads you into figuring things out from little clues as the complexity expands. Combat itself is for the most part relatively simple, and eventually it's possible to find item combinations which make fighting enemies a quick and easy affair. This just highlights the aspect where Alone in the Dark isn't actually a traditional survival horror game, but more of a horror adventure, as combat isn't really a focus for the most part. This is subverted in somewhat negative way in some sequences where you need to figure out the puzzle aspect of the segment while being forced to either avoid or fight respawning enemies, which ended up being my least favorite sequences of the entire game. Alone in the Dark in many ways has a diegetic design, which is most clear in how the inventory has been implemented as the insides of your jacket, and interacting with said inventory takes the form of Edward looking down at himself. Similarly, healing also uses a POV, where you look down at your wounds in first person, while using healing items to treat those wounds. I do like this kind of design, but there is a slight negative aspect to it, as it's not particularly easy to tell how much health you actually have left, and sometimes you might end up in a situation where you might not even realize you're pretty low on health, and then just get one-shot by a larger enemy. But at least the wounds being visible on Edward's body is actually a pretty cool visual. Thankfully, for the most part, this isn't too much of an issue, since as mentioned before, combat really isn't the key component of gameplay. This extends to the final chapter of the game as well, as most of it is spent solving puzzles within the alchemist compound while trying to reach the hiding place of the key. In my opinion, this is one of the best sequences of the entire game, and I would have appreciated even more of this kind of puzzle temple style, and if there had been more of these segments, I think that would have improved the game even further. Similarly, the very end of the game doesn't actually have the player engage in a boss fight, but instead is merely about a choice, the consequences of which weren't made clear beforehand. I really like this, since the combat controls are relatively clunky and having a mandatory boss fight to cap off the game wouldn't really have fit well with the themes of the story either. Which leads us to the controls. When playing with a controller, the game plays pretty smoothly, and it's obvious the controls were primarily designed for the controller. With keyboard and mouse, there are some strange anomalies in how the controls work, and it feels much more clunky than the controller version the controllers do. There's also another kind of aspect of jank, as the game suffered from some strange performance issues, namely occasional stutters at points where new assets were being loaded in, which is very curious considering the technology of today is much more powerful than the machines on which the game was originally intended to be played. Overall, though, those issues were relatively rare, and more often than not, happened during moments when their momentary stutter was completely inconsequential. The 2008 Alone in the Dark does have a bit of a reputation for not being particularly good, but in the end, I did actually enjoy it quite a lot. Sure, it's not what you would have expected from an Alone in the Dark game, as it's not a straightforward survival horror game, but more of an adventure game with combat elements, which is obviously something that wouldn't have pleased longtime fans of the franchise. But as what it is, it serves its purpose surprisingly well, and to me, was a very enjoyable time. Anyway, I would like to thank my Patreon, Ko-fi, and steady supporters: Daniel Heinevetter, High Food Court, Iliad Drone, Paul Leone, Daniel Zipka, Kyriakos, Nazgul Senpai, Artheren, Ville Ojala, Zai, Andrew Juncker, Masaz, The Rain Dog, and Professor Fessa. There are still games in the Alone in the Dark franchise, and I will definitely talk about them as well. But I'm also considering mixing things up a bit and perhaps beginning to change how I handle things on this channel slightly. As I'm writing this, I haven't yet decided on whether I'll jump immediately to the next Alone in the Dark, or if I'll split the franchise by doing something else before going to the next one. Especially considering some future franchises I'm thinking about, I think it's inevitable to prevent burnout that I have to start doing things in a way where I don't just play one franchise for a full year, but having some one-off titles between some of the games. Granted, a partial reason why I'm thinking about this is because the 2024 Alone in the Dark playthrough on Twitch is still ongoing, and considering how it's gone so far, I really don't want to rush it, and instead want to see it to the end. Who knows, by the time this video comes out, it might be done already, but at the time of writing and recording, it's not. But that is it for this time. Thank you all for watching until the end, and thank you to everyone who's been supporting the channel in every conceivable way, whether financially or by watching, commenting, liking and subscribing, and all that other YouTube stuff that is appreciated as it feeds the almighty algorithm. Until next time, Fintrovert, signing out.